My topic is on how we can try to improve access to orphan drugs through innovative financing arrangements. And this may sound like a very technical topic, a topic maybe for finance experts, but actually the principles are very simple. And the principles are the following, that because of the nature of orphan drugs, which are drugs that are intended for small, well-defined patient populations, it's possible to improve access at sustainable cost, and that it can be done in a way which offers to the state predictability in budget financing for the future. Further, it can be done in a way which not only addresses the affordability issue, but also improves patient outcomes. And that we have to work together in innovative partnerships to make these happen. We also have to overcome some obstacles which prevent these kinds of new innovative partnerships and financing arrangements from happening. And I'm going to share with you some of the challenges, but also what is hopefully an optimistic outlook for how these improvements can be achieved. So my presentation is in three parts. The first is to really look a little bit about the particularities of orphan drugs and the development process for orphan drugs, and to explain why, in their opinion, they need to have special treatment from a pricing and reimbursement perspective. Secondly, to look a little bit more about why we need to bring in innovation into pricing and financing for how to pay for these drugs, but also how they can deliver some things which traditional pricing means do not deliver. Thirdly, I'm going to look at some of the other important opportunities to improve access to reducing the gap in care between Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, which can also be implemented with reasonable cost and not very big changes to infrastructure. So I hope overall the balance is going to be on the optimistic side. What was mentioned before, is that actually all the different participants in the drug development process have the same interest at heart. And this interest is to make sure that drugs make it to the patient quickly, and that the right drug reaches the right patient at the right time. But the challenges involved in this process face the different parties differently. From a pharma industry perspective, we have very high research and development costs, while on the other hand, from the perspectives of payers, they're very much concerned with the cost and the sustainability of paying for these drugs. Equally, physicians would like to have more the ability to use these drugs in a real-world setting, and patients need more and better information about what the treatments that are available to them are. So the question is, the existing system may need to be changed, and how can we change it to better reconcile these different objectives? Next slide, please. Next slide. I think many of you are familiar with the challenges in the drug development process, so I'll go over the slide very quickly. But essentially, of the 10,000 candidates which start the development process, usually only one makes it to market, with a process that lasts between 12 and 15 years, and a cost which ranges between $800 million and $1.7 billion. Even when we make it to the phase 2B process, actually only 1 out of every 10 molecules make it to the commercialization process. So what it means, of course, is that it's still very, very challenging to develop these drugs, and the costs are very high. Next slide, please. Now, for orphan drugs, it actually becomes even more difficult due to several considerations. The first is it's very difficult to run the clinical trials because the patients are very small, they're very spread out, and so the costs related to clinical trial design is very high. Equally, for orphan drugs, we have to fulfill all the same clinical trial criteria as those which are required for bigger molecule drugs. And this means, for example, that we have to spend $300 or $400 million on clinical trials when we're speaking about a group of patients that are maybe 50 to 100 patients in a given country or even less. So the development process is even riskier in the orphan drug area. And for a country like Romania, this is also very pronounced. After approval, we have a similar situation, as we have a very limited number of patients with which we can demonstrate the real-world effectiveness of the drug. And so very often what we find is that because we're presenting limited clinical data, payers sometimes use this as an excuse to not reimburse the drug, to challenge us to provide them with more clinical data. And in many cases, this clinical data can only be generated if the drug is introduced, and then you gather data on how the drug performs in a real-world setting. Further, budgeting is complicated for orphan drugs because, as was mentioned in the presentation before me, rather than being given preferred budgeting, in many cases there is some discrimination against orphan drugs because of the perception that it's only a small number of patients that are involved and the cost per patient is very high. So there are some particular challenges for orphan drugs we have to take into consideration. Next slide, please. When the EU orphan drug legislation was created 10 years ago, it was partly to create incentives for pharmaceutical companies to invest in innovation. And I would say this has actually been very successful, meaning the amount of research which is taking place in the orphan drug area is higher than ever. And for one condition alone, such as myelofibrosis, there are actually more than 40 candidates in the development process. So the problem is no longer one where the industry is not incentivized to research. The problem is a little bit different. But when the orphan drug legislation was formulated, it also had another objective, and this is to be in line with European values on solidarity, equality, and integration. So, as was mentioned by Dr. Molnar before, rare, separate, but equal is the principle which should apply to how patients are treated. Next slide, please. The framework has been a success in terms of the number of orphan drugs which have received a positive opinion at EMA. And as you can see, it's accumulated steadily since 2001 to more than 60 molecules that have been approved. Next slide, please. And what has also helped this has been work which has taken place in the countries. So the development of rare disease plans and rare disease strategies has created better infrastructure and better conditions for orphan drugs to be first approved and then used. And I think some words have been said before about the national action plans in rare diseases. But the idea is the next challenge to face the countries is no longer just approving the drugs, but actually creating the infrastructure where they can be used in an effective way. Next slide, please. There's some misperceptions about orphan drug cost and what the benefits have been to European society, because the experience of the last 10 years shows that actually it has been very positive overall experience. Most of the companies that are involved in orphan drug development are small and medium-sized enterprises, and there are more than 2 times the number of companies involved today than there were 10 years ago. There are more than twice the number of clinical trials taking place in the orphan drug area, and overall investment in this area has grown. At the same time, the total budget impact to countries within Europe has been low. So the statistics you see at the middle of the slide shows that Germany, which has the highest expenditure on orphan drugs across Europe, the total expenditure is only 2.5% of pharmaceutical spending. And pharmaceutical spending usually tends to be between 12 and 16% of overall healthcare spending. So what this means is it's less than 0.5% of total healthcare expenditures. And the number is fairly stable and may even decline in the future as you start to see the first wave of innovative orphan drugs reach the end of their life cycle and go off patent. So there will be some savings coming out of patent expirations which can be reinvested into future research and development. Countries like France, Sweden, and Germany. Next slide. But if we recognize that there is a problem, and in fact there is a problem with the pricing and reimbursement of orphan drugs, the question then comes, what can we do about it, and where does the problem come from? So let me show 2 slides about where the problem comes from, so you can see it a little bit from our perspective as a pharmaceutical company, and what we would like to do to help find a solution. So the first problem where it comes from is the fact that not only do you have countries with very different levels of wealth within Europe, but also countries spend different amounts of their GDP on healthcare. And in the case of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, not only do they have the lowest levels of GDP, but they also spend the relatively lowest share of GDP on healthcare. So we have big differences already in the economic background of the countries. And of course, big problems with debt, deficits, and other issues. Next slide. This slide, which looks like perhaps a bowl of spaghetti, in fact shows how international reference pricing works within Europe. And international reference pricing is the process through which countries look at the price level in another country to set their own pricing level. So what we can see is the country in red is the United Kingdom. This is which is the country which is most price referenced. But it means that the way pricing takes place is through this network of price referencing, with countries that have very different level of income and very different levels of GDP. Next slide, please. What this slide shows is that as a reference, as a product of this very mechanical price referencing, combined with the big exchange rate movements that have taken place during the last couple of years, pricing then becomes completely chaotic. And this slide shows a hypothetical exercise we did where we launched one product with one price in 2008, and without us doing anything, purely as a consequence of price referencing and exchange rate movements, there was a 43% change in the price level within 2 years. So it becomes then very difficult for a pharma company to look at a country such as Romania and say, we actually would like to do more for a country like Romania. We would like to find some innovative financing arrangements which will make it easier to reimburse medicines and bring them to the market. But with this background, it's largely out of our control. Okay. Now, the area where innovation is taking place, which can help solve this problem, is by finding innovative solutions to pricing. And some of these ideas are taken from other industries, for example, from telecommunications, from utilities, where you can very often choose between a flexible pricing package or a fixed pricing package. But what this shows is that for this kind of innovation, it's taking mainly place in oncology and in the area of rare cancers in specific. And in a minute, I'll explain why this is the case. But what you can see is a review of 39 innovative pricing schemes across Europe show that more than half of them are in the cancer area. Next slide, please. So what is our position on innovative pricing? And I'll first outline our position, then I'll show a little bit more information on these kinds of schemes. Is as Novartis and Novartis Oncology, we are no longer thinking in terms of price per pill, but we're thinking in terms of price per outcome achieved. And what this means, for example, is that if you focus on the cost of the outcome, okay, not the cost of the actual unit, you have a better measure for assessing value and value creation. So it's a change in philosophy on our part. And this is accomplished through partnerships with the other stakeholders involved. Next slide, please. So if we look at different kinds of innovative pricing schemes and different kinds of risk-sharing schemes, it really depends on what the problem you have in the country, and therefore you choose the best kind of scheme to help address this. If the problem is not knowing how effective a medicine is going to be, it might work on 30% of the patients, then outcomes guarantee programs are the kind of innovative pricing solution that we're piloting. This would be a scheme where, for example, the pharma company would be paid only for the number of patients who reach a predefined outcome after a certain period of time. And the government or the payer would no longer pay for the non-responders. More traditional arrangements, if it's a problem of budget impact or capping the growth in the budget, are pricing and volume agreements, capitation agreements, portfolio agreements, and portfolio trade-offs. And there's some other kinds of schemes as well, value-added services, where, for example, in addition to providing the product, we would provide a compliance monitoring, we would provide nurse educator services, all of which is bound up with the price of the medicine itself.